Let's say the JBoss cluster. Now this is basically a pretty advanced version of JBoss. Not many environments actually use clustering yet, but no, this is especially important in the upcoming days. This super advanced. We will see the concepts of how JBoss clustering gets implemented. And the most important thing is, whenever somebody talks about a JBoss clustering, Apache is kind of mandatory. If not Apache, you need to have some load balancer in front of the JBoss cluster, which actually divides the request. So we will see all those architecture. Pay close attention. Now the general architecture of any cluster is this. This is a pretty simple architecture of a cluster that we are looking at, wherein you have a couple of JBoss instances. This is instance 1 and then instance 2. Now we are not really worried about where these instances are. Both the instances can be on the same box, or they can be on different boxes. They can be standalone instances. They can be in a single domain. All types of variations can actually be implemented for these two instances. Now, when you have multiple such instances, we usually put them into a group and we call that cluster. Now, just like with any other cluster, JBoss cluster also tries to achieve the exact same things, especially the high availability. Now, the high availability is implemented using or achieved using implementing failover. So it implements failover just like any other cluster. Now, to implement that failover, JBoss requires that the HTTP session on one server be replicated on another server. Now, usually this replication is done by a product called InfiniSpan. So when you start a JBoss instance, there is a component called InfiniSpan in it. InfiniSpan is an open source product that provides HTTP session replication. Now the InfiniSpan, which is internally in the JBoss instance, actually helps in the session replication. The HTTP session, which is on instance 1, actually gets replicated to instance 2. Now that is replication. Now to do this replication, the JBoss instances usually use some kind of communication like unicast or multicast. In this case, the unicast or multicast gets used by using what is called JGroups. So JGroups is one of the oldest JGroups means Java groups. Java groups is one of the technologies wherein it creates a multicast mechanism or unicast mechanism. Means JGroups can work both on a multicast model which uses UDP or a unicast model which uses TCP. The default one is JGroups with the UDP. So you will see JGroups being used with the UDP so that these members can communicate with each other. So the replication is done using InfiniSpan. The communication is done using JGroups. Now there should be somebody in front of this entire JBoss cluster that you're seeing here who can divide the requests. So we need an external element outside JBoss cluster to divide the load, and that's usually your your Apache server. Now the Apache server usually has a proxy plugin that can divide the request. Now it's not just one proxy plugin. this being an open source, there are a lot of proxy plugins that were developed. The most important proxy plugins are these three. You will see mod cluster. This is the most advanced proxy plugin available in the market probably. So mod cluster, this is the latest one. Before that there was a proxy plugin by mod JK. This was actually developed for Tomcat server but gets used also in JBoss. Then there is a very basic proxy called mod proxy, which is the least efficient one. So in your case, if you have to recommend the best cluster or the best proxy plugin, it's going to be the mod cluster. So the mod cluster, one of these three proxy plugins can be configured here. Alright, so one of these three proxy plugins can be configured here. You can use either mod cluster, or you can use mod JK, or we can use mod proxy. The differences among these three we will see in a while. But before you configure the proxy plugin, you should have the Apache already installed. And to Apache, we will set up the proxy plugin. So once this setup is done, any incoming requests will be load balanced by the proxy plugin to the backend servers that we have given. Now this entire thing actually forms the total infrastructure of a JBoss cluster. In the JBoss cluster, actually, we have this part. This is the JBoss side. This is the Apache side. So first things first, we will see on the right side how we can set up this entire thing. What are the various elements that we need to set up on the JBoss side, and finally we have to see how to set up the Apache server, and then we have to see how to set up all the three modules also. Now unless you finish all these things, your JBoss cluster is not ready. So setting up JBoss only is not sufficient. You need to have Apache server also to actually do the load balancing. Now let's go ahead and start with the first thing. The first thing we're going to see is on the right side. Means how do we start the instances so that the infinite span is there, the G groups is there, and all that stuff. Alright. So before we go into setting up those things, let's say what are the components usually required to set up a JBoss cluster. Obviously we need the service. Then the servers in this case are basically instances, so we need the JBoss instances. Then we need the messaging model so that these servers can communicate with each other. So the messaging model can be unicast. If it is unicast, then basically it is a one-to-one communication, or it can be multicast. Yes. It can be multicast. If it is unicast, it is TCP based, and if it is multicast, it's UDP based. And the pros and cons of unicast, multicast, we'll talk in a different session. If you already know it, let's go ahead with that. I think if you are done with the WebLogic, you will already know the difference between unicast and multicast. Now again, we have to understand one thing. JBoss is an open source product, so anytime they want to develop something, if a product already exists, the JBoss team wants to use that product. For example, to set up a JBoss cluster, they can write entire code from scratch, or if you see in this case, for the multicast or unicast communication, they use a product called JGroups. JGroups is one of the technologies that was developed at the early JBoss Java stages. Even now it's pretty popular. That allows JVMs to communicate with each other. Now this is also open source. So what JBoss guys did was they took this JGroups concept and they put it in the JBoss servers. So now JBoss servers internally using JGroups can actually communicate with each other using unicast or multicast model. Now this is for communication. The next element that is usually required for setting up a high availability is the replication. Means the HTTP session itself has to be replicated across the servers. Now again, they can write the code, or they have used the existing product, a very popular one called InfiniSpan. So you will see InfiniSpan for the HTTP session replication, JGroups for unicast multicast messaging model, and then the servers themselves. So the servers internally have JGroups in them, InfiniSpan in them. Now once you start the servers with these two things, the right side of this diagram is actually ready, which means when you start the server, you have InfiniSpan in it and InfiniSpan in this one also. So here also you have InfiniSpan, and then they also have JGroups in it. So JGroups, here also the JGroups related thing. Alright, so this is actually for communication, whereas this is for communication back and forth, this is for replication back and forth. Now the same concept can be used for any number of JBoss instances. It's not just two. If you have another JBoss instance like this here, that will also start with its own InfiniSpan, and then it will have its JGroups. Now because JGroups use a multicast address, you will have the multicast address in the same range, that 224.0.0.1 till 239.255.255.255. It's the same range that you will see JBoss related multicasting addresses. Now these things have to be embedded in the JBoss instance when it is coming up. So we're going to use the profiles of JBoss to actually start the servers using which have all these services already embedded in them. So coming back to the list of things that we want to set up a JBoss cluster, you want the servers. The servers should be started with unicast model. The servers should be, this is the servers you want. Then you want the servers to have the JGroups in them. JGroups by default uses multicast. You can change it if you want. Then we want InfiniSpan in the servers. And finally, we need a load balancer like Apache server with the proxy plugin, one of the proxy plugins that we talked about. Now let's go ahead and implement these 4 steps. So the first 3 steps can be implemented in a lot of ways. So we're going to see how you can have a group of servers. And then finally we get into the Apache server integration, installation, and then integration. Now this is the cluster model again, that the same picture is redrawn again with individual components. So you have JBoss instance 1, JBoss instance 2 here. Then each of these JBoss instances has InfiniSpan in it, and also JGroups. Now the JGroups is usually represented in the middle, but as I just now shown it here, it is on both the servers. So there is a JBoss component on server 1 and there is a JBoss component on server 2 also. That will be used for these two servers to communicate with each other. They will be communicating about the replication, they will be communicating about the heartbeats and other stuff also. And on the left side, this is the load balancer with one of the proxy plugins, which we're going to see. So this is overall setup of JBoss cluster that we're going to do. Now if you look at the right side again, the JBoss server can be started. I'll come back to these things again. See this thing. Now when you're setting up a cluster, you can set up in a lot of ways, guys. A cluster simply requires multiple servers. Now the multiple servers can be in standalone mode server, or they can be in domain mode. Again, when they are in standalone mode, they can be on one box, or they can be on different boxes. So for our discussion purpose, let's say we are trying to set up a cluster of 2 JBoss instances. Now, assuming both those instances are in standalone mode, we can have 2 servers within a box in standalone mode. Then we can have 2 servers in 2 boxes also, each box having 1 server. This configuration can be seen here. You have 1 box, 2 JBoss instances, both are in standalone mode. The remaining components will remain same. So instance 1 will have standalone, instance 2 will have InfiniSpan, instance 2 will have InfiniSpan. Both the instances will similarly have JGroups, and on the left side the Apache proxy are same. Now this is if you have 1 box. Now if you want to make it complicated or efficient, in other words, you can divide these instances to 2 different boxes, and that is the configuration here. So now you're looking at standalone mode cluster in 2 boxes. So 2 boxes have 1 server on each box. So this is box 1 you're looking at. This is box 2 you're looking at. Each of these boxes have a JBoss started in it with InfiniSpan and JGroups already embedded. Now when you are setting up the proxy plugin, obviously you give the details or the socket information of instance 1, socket information of instance 2. Now here the naming is wrong here. It has to be instance 2. Alright. Also in this diagram, if you see, even the Apache server is expected to be on a different box. So that's usually the architecture that you will see in real time, that Apache is on a different box. So JBoss on 1 box, JBoss 2 on a 2nd box, and Apache on a 3rd box. Alright, just a moment guys. Just a moment. Okay, let's continue. So this is a standalone mode cluster in 2 boxes. The one that we have seen earlier is a standalone cluster in 1 box. Now just like we have standalone servers, we can put servers in a domain mode also. There won't be any difference at all on the right side. The left side will remain same, means you have a proxy server and the proxy plugin with it. Alright, on the right side you have a domain mode servers in this case. So what we have is a domain mode servers. So if you see here, domain mode servers is what we have. In the domain mode, again, we can have multiple servers here. Again, the components inside these servers are going to be same, the JVM. So you have JBoss server 1.1 and JBoss server 1.2. Each one of them have InfiniSpan in them for HTTP session replication and JGroups for unicast and multicast communication. And as we already talked about, a domain mode has a host controller in it and a process controller in it. But this is no different than standalone servers. The only difference is the way you manage these servers. It's much easier in a domain mode to manage the servers. Now again, the domain mode servers can be in a single box, or they can be on multiple boxes, which you will see on the next screen. This is a multiple box domain mode. The moment you have multiple boxes, obviously you have each box having its own process controller. So this is box 1, you have process controller on box 1 and the host controller. The same way on box 2 also you have process controller and host controller. Because these are multiple boxes, one of these host controllers, especially the first one, is also going to be called as the domain controller. So all the host controllers will connect to the domain controller, and the configuration changes will be updated centrally from domain controller to each one of the host controllers, whereas the process controller controls all the process in the system. Alright, so here you have server 2.1, on this one you have server 1.1. Now any of these 4 setups can be done, and we can simply create a right side of the cluster. So going back to our first diagram, if you see this one, JBoss cluster architecture, this does not really tell you where the instances are and or what mode they've been started in. These 2 instances can be standalone single box instances, standalone 2 box instances, domain mode single box, or domain mode 2 boxes, or multi-box. That's what we call. That's what we have seen here. Apart from these 4 models, there is an additional thing called domain mode with server groups also we can have. That's pretty super advanced. We will do it in another session once we are comfortable with the 4 models. Most of the times in your case, you're going to say you have, if you are especially running JBoss 6, it has to be standalone mode cluster only. Only in JBoss 7 or JBoss EAP 6. Let's say if you are saying, when you say JBoss 6, everybody thinks that it's JBoss AS6. So you have to say JBoss EAP 7, JBoss AS7 or EAP 6. So the domain mode is available in the latest EAP 6 only. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and set up these servers quickly, and then we will get into the Apache. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to start the servers, multiple servers,